So 10 years ago, almost to the night, Leveson made his recommendations for independent press regulation. Since then, there's been bad news and good news. The bad news, of course, is that the government, under pressure from the press barons, obliged them by finding a tiny technical loophole in what had been voted for in Parliament. Despite that not happening, an independent press regulator was formed, called Impress, and it's been an enormous success. In fact, has more members now than Ipso, which of course is the sad remake of the PCC. All the things that the mainstream press aimed at Leveson's recommendations have turned out not to be true when they said, well, an independently regulated press will have a chilling effect on journalism that's critical of the government, has turned out not to be true. When I look at the publications that are members of Impress, people like Left Foot Forward, it's hard to call them chilled about this government. The other thing that was levelled at independent regulation is that it would have it would sort of somehow destroy investigative journalism. But again, if you really look at the publications in Impress, again and again they've scooped the mainstream press. There was an amazing moment in 2018 when Bellingcat was able to reveal the name of one of the suspects in the Salisbury poisoning. And on the same day, the Mail online, their great piece of investigative journalism was that Meghan Markle now liked to shut the car door herself. And that's kind of the difference in cultures we have between the two regulators now. One of them, Impress, very under-resourced, permanently under attack from the government and the mainstream press. The other, Ipso, that has claimed from the beginning that it's going to be the toughest regulator in the world with ability to impose, £1 million fines, which has actually never commenced a single investigation or imposed a single fine.
That's why I have a sneaking respect for Stanley Baldwin, who complained that the major newspapers in 1931 were engines of propaganda for the constantly changing policies, desires, personal vices, personal likes and dislikes of their owners. Nothing has changed. He was right. Client or proprietorial journalism that pretends to be faithful to the truth is a pernicious mockery of the real thing, and we have it live and kicking today. What, after all, are we to make of the Daily Mail's front pages this summer, which celebrated Liz Truss with "Cometh the hour, cometh the woman," and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, at last a true Tory budget? It was if backpedalling were an Olympic sport, the Mail would easily beat Chris Hoy to the podium. But the Daily Telegraph wasn't much better, as it claimed Liz Truss was the competent and proficient, it's difficult to say, was the competent and proficient candidate who was ready to assume the highest political office in the land. And then there's the Daily Express. No one at the top of her party has a better understanding of policy development. And while we're talking about client journalism, what about The Spectator? The prospect of Liz Truss becoming the UK's third female PM is antagonising all the right people, wrote Patrick O'Flynn. And the only bad part of her budget was the support for energy bills, wrote Kate Andrews. But it spooks me, to be honest, that the Facebook algorithm seems to know I am gay. I am. I am 60, hence the Saga holiday adverts. I prefer Sauvignon Blanc to Chardonnay, and I enjoy the theatre. And it disturbs me when I get adverts on Facebook for travel insurance just moments after I've booked a flight. Fictional 1984 had nothing on actual 2022. TikTok is the same. I only ever use the home function, but you'd be amazed what comes up. A great deal of musical theatre, men working out in gyms, men who seem to have lost their shirts, Dr. Pimple Popper, and endless Graham Norton and RuPaul Drag Race clips mixed in with stories about Ukraine. That isn't, I assure you, honestly, because I've searched any of these things out. They find me, I don't find them. I hate to think what face recognition software can and probably is being used for in places of public assembly in China or in Russia. That is problematic enough, but my real beef is with the effect these algorithms have on journalism and political discourse. As they nudge people to political extremes, they promote division, and they pervert the truth by creating an incentive for untruth. Far from caring about the harmful effects of algorithms, the social media companies and their allies stroke competitors in the press rely on them, I think, to make money. The same goes for UK newspapers that fill their online sites with hateful Meghan material. It is becoming their richest clickbait scene, apart perhaps from the sidebar of shame on Mail Online. It drives viewing and earns advertising income, which is why so many British opinion writers pen so much drivel about the couple, not because the story matters, it doesn't, not because the writer genuinely cares about it, they don't, but because it makes money. That is not journalism. It's a perversion of journalism. And yet again, it means that the press see other people's lives as commodities to be traded. It is already shameful that 90% of print media in the UK is in the hands of three companies: News UK with 32%, Daily Mail Group 38%, and Reach 19%. Two companies, Bauer and Global, control nearly 70% of all local commercial radio stations and 60% of national commercial digital stations. It is bizarre that Sky and the BBC contribute to this concentration by running lengthy segments commenting on the daily newspapers. I just don't understand why they do that anymore. When you add in the fact that 40% of people's time online is spent with sites owned by Google or Meta, you can see a real tightening of media concentration in this country and around the world. And with Murdoch, Rothermere and the Barclay brothers not resident in the UK for tax purposes, it is difficult to see how such monopolistic practices are in the interests of consumers, voters, or the general public in this country. Whatever the future holds, I hope it embraces media diversity. That's why the BBC and Channel 4, in public hands incidentally, are both vital for our national soul. So, in my last few moments, I'm calling for 6 things. First of all, higher journalistic standards across news sites and traditional press to counteract the inherent tendency in algorithms towards untruth and the marketing of hatred. Second, greater transparency about how recommender algorithms work and more online opportunities for consumers to opt for news and stories from outside their echo chamber. Thirdly, tighter rules on anonymised fake online accounts run by bots. Fourthly, more research by Ofcom and others into the pernicious or deleterious effects of algorithms. Fifthly, tighter regulation of broadcasters deliberately disseminating conspiracy theories and the online platforms that further amplify them. And finally, new media ownership rules that are fit for the digital era and enable regulators to decide whether a broadcaster or news service company is owned or run by a fit or proper person who is registered for tax purposes in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
But I'd like to come to Haroon now, if I may. Thank you, Ellen. Chris's lecture touched on the obsession parts of the press have with Meghan Markle as an example of marketing hateful material. And you were one of the co-organisers of a letter from journalists of colour which called out the Society of Editors' apparent claim that racism in the press was overstated or in fact didn't exist at all. Some of the signatories to that letter were quite junior, and the Society of Editors, let's face it, is a really powerful organisation in the industry. How difficult and challenging was it to stand up to them in that way?
I mean, to be honest, for someone like me, it was easy because I worked for The Guardian and I never had any kind of qualms that there would be any blowback. And I think it's fair to say it's not just because I've been at The Guardian a long time, 15 years, but I think everyone at The Guardian felt the same way. But when you're looking at other organisations, I had people who, well, I know there were people who initially, even from the BBC, put their names on and were then told to take them off. And some of them tried to kind of ignore it, but then they were given ultimatums. And I think in the end, one BBC person kept their name on, but the others, understandably, took their names off. I know there were people at other papers who said, at the Independent, there was someone who said they didn't feel, and that might surprise you because the Independent's kind of liberal perspective. And then there were other people at papers like the Mail who contacted me and said, please keep me updated, but didn't sign themselves. And I'm sure there are people who didn't agree with what we were saying and journalists of colour who didn't agree with what we were saying. But I think it's obvious that there were people at other publications who would have liked to sign, but either were self-censoring or they were being censored. As I say, I know at the BBC they were censored. So I think it took real courage. I think there was. I looked back at the letter today actually, and I saw there was one person from the Mail who signed, and I remember he contacted me, and he was a trainee sub-editor, and I actually, when he emailed me and he said, I think there are no tabloid people on it. I think maybe there were later on, maybe someone from the Mirror, but he said, so I'm really keen for my name to be on it. And I actually thought, I felt a bit of a moral quandary. I thought, is this guy going to get in trouble? But I thought, that's what he wants to do. And so I think for someone like that, it took real courage. I looked him up today, and he's not at the Mail, but hopefully the two things aren't connected, and he just moved on to where he wanted to be.
And I'm very interested in your view, because of the fascinating side of the statistics that Chris went into regarding the coverage of Meghan Markle. I mean, people within the industry must be quite shocked by things like that. Do you notice any change in the way that her profile is being covered?
I think there's probably a one-word answer to that, which is no, I'm afraid not. My experience, I know plenty of people at other newspapers, and whenever they speak about whether it's Meghan Markle or Raheem Sterling, I find it quite depressing, because they tend to, whether they believe it or not, they tend to justify it by saying it's not because he's black, it's not because she's mixed race. They say, it's because Raheem Sterling was greedy when he left Liverpool for Manchester City, was it? Yeah.
So there's a sense of trying to justify.
Yeah, and I just see that, and I don't really see. I'm pleased that the Society of Editors did withdraw the original statement, but I think their influence is limited to some extent, and I think the reason it took them 5 months to withdraw it.
I think the chair resigned in the end.
Yeah, exactly.
But Nathan, Chris spoke about social media and the harmful outlets which exist across the web. We know this Leveson system works for newspapers, but is it applicable to other kinds of titles like blogs and other sites peddling disinformation or social media across the web?
So the answer to that is yes, absolutely. And in fact, a lot of Impress members at the moment are blogs or hyperlocal outlets, online only. The system is completely neutral as to whether it's a print or online, or how big or how small it is. And one of the virtues of the system is that it complements other systems of regulation very well. So Ellen was talking earlier about the online safety bill. Now, we would say, if you want to exempt news publishers from a bill that's going to regulate social media, what you should just say is, if you're a newspaper and you're in an independent Leveson compliant regulator, then you're out of the system. You get your exemption on that basis. And that's what the bill already says for broadcasters. So at the moment, the bill says if you've got a broadcast license, then you're exempt because you're covered by Ofcom. What it says for newspapers, as Ellen explained earlier, says you don't have to be regulated at all. You've got to have some staff, you've got to have an office, you've got to have a complaints process and a standards code. That code could say this newspaper is inaccurate all the time. The complaints process could say write down your complaint on a letter and post it to Lapland. All of that qualifies. So what the government is essentially saying is that any organisation, and there are some very dangerous publishers out there, Ellen mentioned Russia Today, there are openly fascist blogs and other outlets on the internet, Holocaust in our websites, Chris mentioned that issue earlier, all kinds of really unpleasant and horrific stuff that is all going to be able to access this exemption in the way the government has drafted it. And why has the government drafted it that way? They've done it just because national newspapers don't want to be independently regulated. Because a competent and uncorrupt government would say, if you want the exemption, you have to be regulated. But because the press have said, no, we won't be regulated, the government has said, okay, we'll just create this massive loophole for you that all kinds of other nasty publishers will get through. And they've put the interests of the public, and even we're talking even about kind of issues that are touching on national security, when we're talking about hostile state-sponsored disinformation, Russia Today, and there's lots of other examples as well. The government has said all of those issues don't matter because national newspapers don't want to be regulated. And that's our priority, to protect their interests. And you asked Ellen earlier, are legislators aware of this? Well, Ellen's told them in a public bill committee that this is a problem. We've submitted evidence time and again. They have received a legal opinion about this issue, and still they have done nothing, except, as Ellen said, made this kind of half-hearted, well, we'll try and find a way to take Russia Today out a few months ago. And by the way, they've not actually acted on that yet either. So we're really concerned about that.
Equally, and the separation of powers is absolutely crucial to a democracy, and unfortunately Leveson, in part 2 of the inquiry, was going to actually look in much more depth about that, because the fact that the relationship between the senior police officers and some of the newspaper owners and editors got too close. There were some politicians that were too close to newspaper editors, and in fact some newspaper editors were holding politicians to ransom and not account, and there became a very grey and muddy area about the rule of law being applied here, and whether or not it was done properly. And Leveson 2, part 2, would have got to the bottom of that.
Mike, Jackie's absolutely right. We should still be having Leveson 2, because we don't really know yet what actually happened at the News of the World. And that was part of what was going to happen once the police investigation had been finished.
It's fundamentally, Leveson Part 2 is fundamentally about finding who was responsible for the hacking scandal, the data theft scandal in the noughties, the cover-up. It's about upholding the rule of law, apart from anything else. And I think it's extraordinary that it's a Conservative party, which makes a big play about how it's the party of law and order, which has actually said, do you know what? Police corruption, criminality, it's okay if it happens between them and the press. Because that's essentially what they did when they decided to cancel the second part of the Leveson inquiry, against the wishes of many of their own party members and MPs as well. So we're very hopeful that a future government of whatever stripe will be willing to reopen that.
Kick off just with a comment on, absolutely, freedom of expression has really been kind of I think the most hotly kind of contested thing around the online safety bill in particular, and the kind of idea of social media regulation, and is really where a lot of the kind of discussion around news publisher exemptions and so forth has come from. And I think where the kind of current approach really fails is it takes a very narrow view of freedom of expression, and it sees the primary threat to freedom of expression is your content being taken down. And that's kind of how the bill operates at the minute, is that's the kind of thing that it tries to guard against. And then it sort of thinks its freedom of expression duties are done. And we have a lot of concerns, partly that obviously the bill is coming within a wider political context in which human rights more widely are under attack, including freedom of expression. And I think that's a kind of real concern, that's the context that we're operating in the context in which the regulation is being proposed. But I think there's also a real kind of freedom of expression threat from lack of regulation, which I know sounds a bit counterintuitive, but if we think about the kind of effects that mass disinformation campaigns, mass abuse campaigns have on freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association, all of these freedoms that we really care about, there's the chilling effect of the social media platforms, being able to effectively dictate the terms of public discourse and the terms of what information we can access and how, I think is really serious. So I absolutely agree that freedom of expression really needs to be at the heart of these conversations. But I think having a wider view of the different ways that freedom of expression is threatened is really important.